Hi, welcome to the Three Times podcast. In this episode, I travel as far north as I can go in Northumberland without falling off the edge, to talk to Kimball, one of a small number of people in the county who make and fettle the Northumbrian pipes, and who is no mean player himself. There are three parts to this episode. In the first, Kim talks about the history of the pipes and how the different styles of playing have evolved. In the second, he describes the intricacies of making a set of pipes from the raw materials. And if you wonder how someone who ranked among the country's foremost instructors of canoeing and kayaking has now become one of its leading pipe makers, then listen to part 3. You can find out more about the pipes from Kim's website, which is listed in the show notes, where you can also find information about the tunes that Kim plays in the podcast. This is part 1. Kimball.
Hello.
Thank you for agreeing to be on the Three Times podcast.
You're very welcome.
I mean, obviously there is a long tradition of playing the Northumbrian pipes, but is there a large body of work that's been handed down, and from how far back does that date?
Yeah. Okay. So, I suppose bagpipes as a musical instrument are fairly commonly seen in medieval paintings and things like that. There's a beautiful little sculpture of a bagpiper in the Abbey in Hexham. I don't know whether you've seen it.
I haven't, no.
But if you go in the main entrance to Hexham Abbey, and then you know the big altars up on the right hand side, the main altar. If you go along the far wall behind it, there's a little quiet prayer area, and there's an old wooden panel there that's been carved in various stories from the Bible or Aesop's fables and things like that. And one of them is this lovely little bagpiper, and he's about, 15, 16 inches tall, and he's carved into this relief panel, I suppose. And I mean that dates back well into medieval times. So certainly from medieval times, bagpipes were common everywhere as a main instrument. But in terms of referring to them in literature, the bagpipes are just called the pipes. But so were lots of other instruments. So you'd have things that look more like a recorder. They were called the pipes. Whistles were called the pipes. So just because something is talked about as being somebody played the pipes, you couldn't say whether it was bagpipes or another instrument. But the first... and they weren't just a Scottish thing then. So they were all over Europe, all over England, all over Wales. And then the first reference to something that really seems to be close to what we now call Northumbrian pipes is documented in 1695, I think it is. And that's of certainly somebody who's got a bag that's inflated, I think it's by bellows, and it's a chanter that's played. And the thing that's unique about Northumbrian bagpipes is that the chanter is what's called enclosed, and that basically means that the end of it is stopped, so there's no open hole at the end. So if you ever listen to a Highland piper, a Scottish piper, there's always a sound going, whether they're playing different notes on the chanter or not, and that's because the end of the chanter is open. So that means that the note that comes out the end of the chanter is there all the time, And then by raising or lowering different fingers or combinations of fingers on a Highland pipe, that note changes, and therefore you get the melody.
Yeah.
Now the Northumbrian pipes are different, and they're fairly unique in that they've got what's called a closed chanter. So that means the end of the chanter is blocked off. So that means that when you've got all your fingers covering the finger holes, there's no sound from the chanter itself. You've just got the gentle hum of the drones in the background.
Yeah.
And then to create one note, you lift one finger, and then you put that finger back down when that note's finished. So that means that between different notes, you get silences as well.
Yeah.
So it creates quite a unique sound in terms of bagpipes. And this type of pipe is referred to in 1695. So certainly we can start to see that of all the different branches of pipes that had evolved, something closely resembling the Northumbrian pipe was around in this area in 1695, and not just here, in Holland and places on the continent as well. Obviously there were strong trade links with the continent, so there was transfer of culture as well as the sort of industrial stuff.
Just to be clear, can you lift more than one finger at a time to get the different, or is it just one finger at a time?
You can, but you don't.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
There's not a note in the scale that we would recognise.
No. It's not so much that. It's that if you were going to do that, you might as well play the Highland pipes or another type of pipe.
Oh, I see.
So the thing that gives you the Northumbrian pipes its unique style and sound is the fact that you don't do that because because of the sound it creates by not doing it.
I see. Yeah.
Not because you could do it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So there's another instrument that looks quite similar to a Northumbrian bagpipe. It's called the Scottish small pipes, and that's got an open end.
Yeah.
And that is played with more than one finger open at a time, and obviously you've got this note going all the time.
Yeah.
So the Scottish small pipes, unless you look very closely, look very similar to an unkeyed Northumbrian pipe chanter and a Northumbrian pipe set, but they sound very different because of the way they play and the ability of a Northumbrian piper to have silence between notes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in terms of the body of work, you mentioned or asked about, so we're looking about 1695 to the first reference of instruments. Certainly throughout the 1700s there was a lot of activity around in Northumberland where we've also got manuscripts of what looks like bagpipe music. So there was a family called the Dixon family from Stamfordham, and they had a handwritten manuscript which has been found in recent years, having been lost for a long time, and that dates from about 1720, 1730, and there were lots of tunes played throughout Britain at that time, and you can tell whether it's bagpipe music or fiddle music or flute music generally by the number of notes that are used. So with the Northumbrian pipes as they were then, or the border pipes as they were then, basically you had one note per finger. And you basically used your thumb, just like a recorder. If people are familiar with the recorder, it's basically the same way that you'd hold a recorder. So by lifting one different finger, you'll get a different note. And bagpipe music fits the range of a chanter. Whereas fiddle music, you can play a fiddle from very low down to very high up on the neck. So the range of a fiddle tune would be a lot greater than the range of a pipe tune. So having these manuscripts by, there's a lot of tunes in a manuscript by William Vickers, like I said, the Dixon manuscript. A lot of these seem to be quite clearly pipe tunes. And then towards the end of that century, so in the late 1700s, we are now, aren't we? There was somebody who was making Northumbrian pipes called Dunn in Newcastle, and he started the development of just increasing the range of the Northumbrian pipes by adding keys, like you'd see keys on a flute or a clarinet or something like that. So as well as having your finger holes, you would then have some keys that you could operate with your spare thumb. You had one thumb that wasn't covering a finger hole, and you had one little finger that wasn't covering a finger hole. So those two fingers, well, that finger and that thumb, could be used to manipulate some keys. And he created a chanter that had 4 keys to give it a slightly greater range. And then Peacock was the next sort of manuscript of note, and that was in the very early 1800s. And Peacock wrote tunes, or had not necessarily written all the tunes, but certainly had gathered tunes that were being played in the area on Northumbrian pipes, and he put them in one manuscript, and he printed this off. So for the first time, we had a production of a musical manuscript that people could go and buy. And he was the teacher of Buick. So Buick's Museum in Mickley, the engraver. So his son was a keen Northumbrian piper, and he had a really nice set of Northumbrian pipes made for him, I think by Dunn, and also he was playing Peacock's tunes at that time. So these little interesting local history things are popping up all over the county, which is really, really nice.
And sorry to interrupt you there. Where would this music be played?
So Northumbrian pipes are quiet instruments, so they are really designed to be played indoors. And parlour instruments, lounge instruments. So they were. So whereas this is where they'd branched away from the Highland pipes side of things. So the Highland pipes played obviously north of the border, very loud. Used in battles and all sorts of things to scare the heebie-jeebies out of the enemy. But there's a sort of like a hybrid. So there's a bellows blown pipe, and it's called the border pipes. Now it's got several different names, but the border pipes, the lowland pipes, it's all the same type of instrument. But they were played both sides of the border, so Northumberland and in the Scottish borders and the lowlands. And they're a bellows blown pipe, but it's more like a Highland pipe sound, but not as loud and not as brash. So they're not played at a higher pressure as the Highland pipes are. And these were played by the sort of the town waits, and so in those days most towns would have their own piper. And that piper was paid by the town, so Hexham would have had one. And those pipers were paid by the town parish council or the town council, and one of their jobs was to go around in the morning and wake everybody up. So they needed quite a loud outdoor pipe, but they'd play at civic events, fairs and things like that.
So it's not kind of a, because the image that I've always had about the Northumbrian pipes is it's like the corner of a pub. So it's not like the thing you do in a loud hostelry.
No,
to try and entertain the guests.
No, so the lowland pipes, the border pipes, would have been that type of instruments, and they would have been used at parties and, you know, weddings and all sorts of things like that. But the one of the things that makes the lowland pipes and the Highland pipes so loud and the sound they create so distinctive is the fact that the bore of the chanter is what we call a conical bore. So that means it's flared, so it has a narrow opening at the top where the air comes in. You've got your finger holes on the way down, and it gradually opens up in the shape of a cone until the air comes out the bottom, and the entrance hole at the top is perhaps, I don't know, 4 mil, something like that, 4 millimeters. The exit hole at the bottom of the bell is, you're looking at sort of 25, 30 mil, so there's quite a flare. Northumbrian pipes are different in that it's a parallel bore, so it's basically drilled with a long drill of now it's about 4.3 millimeters, and it's a consistent parallel bore for the full length, and that makes them fairly quiet across their full range. But they were designed really or evolved as indoor instruments that you'd play in sort of civilised company as an after dinner piece. So because of that, they've never been very loud. And one of the problems that I had, and I found fairly early on, is that if I went to play my pipes at a mixed instrument session, you sit next to a fiddler on one side and an accordionist on the other side, and you can't hear yourself. You can't hear yourself play. So, you know, even if you're in a busy pub and there's a lot of conversation, you know, the Northumbrian pipes are very much in the background. They don't cut through. They don't stop the next table from talking. Whereas you can imagine that with a Highland piper. No, they come in. Conversation.
The bar.
That's right.
Frank.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So so they're very much a parlour instrument, and they were probably played more by they would have been expensive to make then. And there weren't that many dedicated makers either. So back in those days, in the 1800s, the people that made Northumbrian pipes were often doing it as a sideline to something else. So one of the main makers at the time was Dunn, like I mentioned before. And then in the early 1800s, the Reed family from Newcastle started to make pipes, and they as well as making pipes used to make all sorts of other things, you know. So, you know, umbrellas comes to mind as pipe makers, other things, watchmakers. Because they had the different tools that were needed for these different industries. And they would might work on a piping project one week and make an umbrella the next week, or a watch the next week, or whatever it was. So that was all very interesting to think that they weren't specialists; they were quite generalists then. But I imagine that the pipes would have been quite expensive to make, and then something did change, because I think probably. As well, we were living at we weren't living, were we? But they were living at a time then where if you often wanted something, you had to do it yourself. So I imagine that if people wanted a set of Northumbrian pipes, then the obvious solution is to learn how to make it yourself, or get one and copy it. So there seemed to be a shift in the mid 1800s to them being an instrument mainly played by sort of the middle classes and above, to an instrument that suddenly became available, not on any large scale, but starts to pop up in perhaps some rural community farms, but certainly in the urban area of Northumberland, in the mining areas. And the Northumbrian pipes is one of the like I said, I think earlier on, is that bagpipes were common throughout the whole of Britain through the Middle Ages, but slowly the popularity of bagpipes within English counties started to die away and die out. And I think, the thinking seems to be was that as fiddles became more and more available and fiddle music developed, is that people could play more on a fiddle than they could on pipes, and therefore if they wanted music for parties and things, it was fiddle music. So there's the popularity of the fiddle increased, so the popularity of bagpipes declined, and there were a few little areas where that didn't happen, and Northumberland is probably one of the last. And certainly in terms of tracing back the ancestry of Northumbrian pipes, there is a definite unbroken chain back to those medieval pipes, and the music that was written, and historically records of families of pipers who over several generations, father to son, it tended to be the men of the family, but father to son played the pipes. And it was a small piping community, so they would learn from other people that you might have heard of from, and you think, oh, hang on a minute, they were learning the pipes here, and they're saying they were taught by this guy over here, and we know something about him and what he went on to do, and then that lineage comes all the way to modern times, so we can trace back some peoples who were taught by pipers, 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 and some of those pipers who are playing now, you can trace back their sort of piping family tree, if you like, all the way back to the early 1800s.
And presumably from what you say about surviving manuscripts, there's nothing left of the piping tradition from further south.
A lot of the tunes further south are still local tunes, but I don't think any of them are known so much as being piping tunes. But maybe that's just because the instruments don't exist now. So, I mean, there have been some. There are some Welsh pipes. I think Lincolnshire might have some. But again, I think it's a resurrection rather than than an unbroken thread. But there are some pockets, but nothing on any scale, and nothing that seems to have lasted and been as visible as Northumbrian piping has been. And I suppose part of that has been not part of that maybe, but some things that do help are that the Duke of Northumberland historically has had his own piper that's been in retention for him, and that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. That tradition. So again, these Northumbrian pipers get wheeled out at ceremonies and things like that, and they end up playing for the king or the queen or whoever's just because of links through nobility.
Who holds that position now?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's Andrew Davison or whether it's vacant. It might be Andrew Davison now. I should really have known that. But yes, the person that was the Duke's piper for a good 20-25 years passed away a year or so ago. And yes, I think it's Andrew Davison now has inherited that position.
And the first time I heard Northumberland pipes was when I was up here. I didn't even know they existed until I moved to Northumberland back in the 80s, and then it was kind of, I just happened to cross it. It wasn't even on programs about folk music on the radio as it was then. I just happened to come across it at some. I think it must have gone to a performance. Not because I was seeking out Northumbrian pipes, just they happened to be there. So would I be right in inferring that they sort of continue to be played at a local level and kind of inauspiciously and without trying to promote them, but then there was an interest in their popularity. And I'm thinking particularly of Catherine Tickell. That was the first name that I came across.
Yeah.
And presumably there was somebody that she learned from before the kind of explosion of interest in Northumbrian pipes.
Yeah. So the I suppose if you trace back the lineage, there was organised piping that can be traced back. So there's been a Northumbrian Pipers Society. It's one of the oldest societies that there is for this type of thing, and it dates back again to the 1800s. And the Northumbrian Piping Society has always organised competitions. In terms of traditional music, that was the way things were. There was always quite a prestigious competition and people sought to be the best piper. And most or many shows and fairs would have had a Northumbrian piping competition, as well as the society running their own competition. So Bellingham Show still has a Northumbrian piping competition every year, and that's one of the oldest long-running Northumbrian piping competitions any type.
Just goes to show how even somebody who's interested in music can completely miss this.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
If they don't keep their eyes open.
Yes.
Guilty as charged.
Indeed. And then back in, again, the 1800s, they were worried about traditional music dying out. So just, music dying out and traditions dying out is not a new thing.
No.
It's an old thing. So, for example, border pipes that I mentioned, that is a broken lineage because border pipes basically stopped being played, and they were revived probably about 20, 30 years ago, and we don't know what border piping sounded like 200 years ago because it's broken and we've had to almost reinvent it. Whereas Northumbrian piping, we've got the manuscripts of people like Peacock who were teaching at the time, back in the early 1800s. We've got then the Clough family, and they were from the pits around Blythe area, and they go back to the early 1800s, and they taught father to son until really the last generation. And they wrote their own tune books, so they documented all their music, so we know what these people were playing. They also, this is wonderful, they used to write to each other in those days. They used to write letters. And
that long ago.
They did, yeah. And they would write letters about reams and reams of letters about Northumbrian piping. So we've got that, all that documentation is still there. And
first evidence of a nerd.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And they would talk very specifically about what was good playing technique and good playing style and what was bad, and they used to swap ideas about learning, and they would talk about the students they were teaching, and so that there's a whole wonderful wealth of information all about them, which is great. And then we've got some of the earliest recordings as well that were made back in the early 1900s that were pressed to vinyl, so we know what they sounded like. So we've got them talking in letter form about how they should play. We've got their manuscripts of what they were playing, and we've got some early sound recordings of them as well. So we know what the traditional pipers sounded like from 100 years ago, which is great. However, it's fairly niche. So you do have reviews of, these Northumbrian pipers, they were asked to go off and perform. So that they might maybe be taken down to London to perform at some great big affair, and you would then get a write up in some national newspaper, a review, and some of them thought it was fantastic, and others thought that's awful, and they would just say it. They say the sound is absolutely terrible, and the language they use to describe it with is very very colourful, and they didn't hold any punches back in those days as well about bad reviews. So it is I'm not going to say it's like a Marmite thing, but they're certainly, if people didn't like stuff, they said. And then so that's, I suppose that's now what we call the Northumbrian piping tradition. That's when we talk about traditional playing, we're talking about I suppose going back to the earliest piping manuscripts that we've got and the recordings that we've got of people like the Clough family and their playing. And then as other influences came, so with the advent of radio, people could listen to other music from other areas, and suddenly, people could sit up in a place in Northumberland and hear a broadcast on Irish traditional music, whereas before that nobody had heard it, and the style, because they were all in different isolated communities, was so different. So suddenly, some people thought, well, actually, if only we could play that. So some people started to adapt what I've referred to as traditional Northumbrian style playing to incorporate some of the sounds and techniques that Irish fiddlers were using or Irish pipers were using, who were playing Irish pipes. And the sound is so different to Northumbrian pipes. And so that started to influence playing styles. And again, if you go back to the 1920s, 30s and 40s, when the radio shows were starting to become more widespread, you get great Northumbrian pipers who are technically fantastic, but starting to experiment with other styles or being influenced by other styles. So people like Billy Pigg would start, and he was a superb piper. And he could play very traditional Northumbrian style, but he also started to experiment with, heaven forbid, lifting more than one finger at a time.
Oh, right.
So, which had already mentioned as, if we think about traditional Northumbrian style, that was very much a no-no. So these things started to come along. So that was interesting, because that started to introduce, raised eyebrows within the tradition.
I can imagine.
Yeah. And then, I suppose traditions do evolve, don't they? So they're not necessarily set in stone. So there are some players that like that sound, some players that didn't like that sound. So you then started to get variations in technique and style. And then you got back into, I suppose, the 60s and the 70s, and again there were sort of more folk revivals going on. And people again were starting to think about, well, actually, if I'm going to become a musician and I want to make a living from it, I have to have a product that's going to sell. So traditional Northumbrian style piping probably wouldn't be a big seller.
No.
Whereas if you can make it sound more appealing to a wider audience, then you probably could sell stuff. So Northumbrian pipers would then start to record music, and they would realise they'd probably make more sales if they played it in a certain way. So certainly people like Catherine Tickell, she plays in a style that probably wouldn't have been endorsed 100 years ago by the Clough family, for example. But in terms of, like you've said, it's many people's first hearing of Northumbrian pipes, because it is a popular way of playing the pipes. People generally seem to like it. So if you're of the point of view that you like the Northumbrian pipes because of the very traditional way they were played, and you like the history, and you like the tradition of that 18th century style, then you've got that mode you can stick to, and there are lots of pipers that play just like that.
Can you name, just for the listeners, could you name one or two that they might seek out?
Yeah, so Chris Ormston is probably, well, he I think was largely self-taught, but he learned a lot of the Clough style, basically. So he resurrected the Clough style, and knew the descendants of the Cloughs as well, and went and played with them and for them, and got the nod of approval from that family, which is the family that have got that lineage all the way back to the mid 1800s. And yes, so Chris is still playing today. He lives in Ovingham. And I went down, had some lessons with him, and that's the style that I like as well.
Right. Okay.
And Chris has taught people as well. So there's a young lad called called Andrew Barris, and he's been learning from Cliss, and he plays in a relatively traditional style. So that style is still continuing, which is great. And then you've got the people who perhaps have liked the sound of pipes because they've heard them from someone like Catherine Tickell and thought, I'd like to learn that, and they've learnt the pipes, and they've never really perhaps never had an interest in the history side of things, but just like playing them as a musical instrument, and their influences are more modern approaches and styles of playing. So there's a lot of different styles of Northumbrian piping that are going on within the area, all under the banner of Northumbrian piping. But actually, if you did scratch away the surface, they're all quite different.
Yeah, but that's healthy, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, it is. It depends on your point of view. There are certainly people that are keen to keep the tradition alive as it was 100 years ago, and it would be a real shame if that tradition were to die out, because we have seen that with lots of other instruments. For example, I mentioned border piping. We don't know how they played or what they played or what they sounded like 100 years ago, and it would be a shame if that was lost. But yes, things naturally change, don't they? And that's been reflected in the instrument. So I mentioned before the changes of perhaps one of the reasons why bagpipes died out throughout the rest of the country was that fiddles came along and they've got a greater musical range. Well, perhaps one of the saving graces of Northumbrian pipes was that Dunn, who I mentioned was making pipes around the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, he started to put keys on, and he started with 4 keys. And then the Reed family started to make pipes, and they were making pipes in the early 1800s. And they developed a 7-key chanter. Yeah. And then they slowly added more and more keys until you got a fully chromatic chanter over a few octaves with 17 keys. Right. So perhaps that was the saving grace, because that meant that you could now play fiddle repertoire tunes on Northumbrian pipes. Yeah. And perhaps without that development of the keys, we might have seen the Northumbrian pipes dying out like other bagpipes have throughout the rest of the country. Yeah. So that evolution, it's moved away from tradition, and certainly the tunes you can play are more and more varied. You can still play them with a Northumbrian style, but yes, I suppose the traditions do evolve. And the Clough family, who I've mentioned as the stalwarts of the tradition, as we call it, or that they played with 17 key chanters and things like that, and they developed fantastic technique to be able to play all the keys, which is quite an achievement really, because as I mentioned before, the chanter, you play it with like a recorder chanter, your fingers and thumbs are nearly all involved with covering up holes, except one thumb and one finger. So you've got your thumb on your right hand that's free, and you've got your little finger on your left hand that's free. So that's fine when you've got a keyless instrument with just those few holes in, because you don't need that finger and thumb anyway. But then when they started to add more and more keys, you still needed all your fingers and thumbs committed to covering the tone holes. So each key had to be put in a certain place where it could be accessible either by that one thumb or that one little finger. And then to get up to 17 keys that are all operated by one thumb or one finger, certainly if you were designing the instrument from scratch, you wouldn't have started, but it's evolved into that now. So people that are fully proficient to play a set of pipes with 17 keys in, it's quite a skill.
Right. So where could somebody go in Northumberland to, especially in West Northumberland, to hear pipes played live?
Okay, so one of the best places is the Chantry Museum in Morpeth. Right. So yes, believe it or not, we have our own Northumbrian piping museum.
I didn't know that.
In Morpeth. Yeah, so the Chantry is next to the bridge over the river, the main road bridge in Morpeth, and it's upstairs is a museum. Downstairs is a little tourist information centre, and in there you can see examples of some of the Northumbrian sets of pipes that have been made over the years, going back to some of these early makers that I mentioned, like Dunn and Reed, as well as border pipes and some other instruments as well. But it is there are lots of Northumbrian pipes in there. The Northumbrian Piping Society have a play around meeting in there once a month. It's on a Saturday afternoon. And so if you were to get in touch with the Chantry and ask when that next was, it's an informal, it's not a concert, but Northumbrian pipers know it's on. Whoever fancies it just goes along and they sit in a circle. Somebody will start a tune off and others will just join in, and it's all very informal like that. But it's in the public area of the museum, so you can just wander in, have a listen and wander out. And then as well as that, there are various other groups that meet and play throughout the area, and it tends to be some of them are public sessions, some of them aren't. So there's a session that I've started to go to fairly recently. There's a pub at the end of the bridge, the high level bridge on the Gateshead side of the river in Newcastle, and the pub is called the Station East. And it's a Thursday evening from about 8 o'clock, again once a month. I think it's the third Thursday of the month. We just go and sit in there, and there's about 5 or 6 of us, 7, 8 of us who just meet up and play in there, and it's just in a public bar. So these things are available. They're not widely advertised to the general public, but they do exist.
And is it a small community of pipers? You all know each other?
Generally, yes. And this is where it's really interesting, because everyone thinks, Northumbrian pipers, they all must know each other and they'll all play the same stuff, they all know this, but it's not like that at all, because the county is quite big and there's a lot more activity over in the urban side. So Newcastle, Blythe, up that way, than there is over on the west, over this side. And because of the size of the county, I suppose, and just the logistics of getting east to west, going north and south's easy, isn't it? Up the A68, up the A1. But going from here across to Rothbury, for example, so we're in Burness now, which is where I live. To get to Rothbury, you're looking at 45 minutes. To get to Alnwick, an hour. To get over to the coast, a bit longer still. So people don't necessarily mix that way, east to west, a lot. And so the repertoires have diverged a bit. So you tend to find that you go along to one playing group. You can always predict what tunes will come up on that night, and once you started going and you've been there, a month or two, you'll probably know all the tunes, and you'll know what's going to come up that evening. And then you'll go and join in another session somewhere else, and it's amazing how varied the repertoire would be. So there'll be lots of tunes there. You think, oh, I haven't played that one before, and it's quite a good way of learning new tunes, just to go and play with other people.
And is that reflected in slightly different styles of playing too?
It can be, yeah. I mean, individuals have different playing styles. Nobody's that pointy-fingered to each other about a playing style. So if people are playing very closed fingering, which is where you play one note at a time with a gap between each note. Even if the tune goes at 1,000,000 miles an hour, if you recorded it and then analysed the sound wave, you'd see a gap between each note. So that closed fingering style, you could have a piper playing like that, and then sitting next to them, you could have somebody playing with what we call an open finger style, which is where there'd be lots of open grace notes, which is where you'd have one note sounding, and then you might open another finger higher up to make a different noise, and then you put that finger back on, so that if you analyse that sound wave, there would be sound all the time as the pitch of the note changed. So people would be sitting next to each other playing all those different styles, and nobody would be particularly pedantic or bothered by it.
Thanks for listening to the 3 Times podcast. Please subscribe and tell your friends about it.